Welcome everyone to the Gray Literature Searching webinar. So this webinar is entitled Gray Literature Searching, Trial Registries, Working Papers, and More. Next slide, please. I'll begin by just introducing myself and my co-presenter. My name is Annie Armstrong. I'm an associate professor in the UIC library. I'm the coordinator of teaching and learning services over at the Daily Library in the Research Services and Resources Department. And I'm also a liaison to the departments of psychology and the College of Education. And these are growing areas for evidence synthesis research. And I'm happy to be here co-presenting with my colleague, Rosie Haneke, an associate professor at the Library of the Health Sciences and our newly appointed systematic reviews librarian. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of housekeeping. You're welcome to either hold your questions till the end of our talk or put them in at any point that you have a question, and we'll address them after we complete our presentation. Emily Johnson Barlow is here to address any problems that you might have during the webinar. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. She'll also be sharing links to resources that we mentioned during the webinar today. And the recording will be shared with you, not immediately, but within a week of the presentation. We'll contact you with a link as well as any additional resources that we share during the webinar. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to give an overview of what we intend to cover today, we'll begin with just some baseline definitions just to get everyone on the same page with what we mean by gray literature and provide a rationale for why you would want to include the gray literature in an evidence synthesis review. Rosie will then go into some strategies for searching, and these are informed by her own research as well as her many years of working with people to support their evidence synthesis reviews. And by evidence synthesis, I mean systematic reviews, scoping reviews, meta-analyses, so any form of evidence synthesis research. And I'll try to avoid saying that too much because it's a little bit difficult for me to say. So she will also then expand on how to document your searches and also report them ultimately in your manuscript. Next slide. Okay, so there are many articles about the gray literature, and we'll share these with you at the end of the webinar, but they all seem to lead back to this same definition. So I'm starting here with a definition of the gray literature, and this is a very broad concept, which encompasses basically manifold document types produced on all levels of government, academics, business, and industry in print and electronic formats, protected by intellectual property rights. And then another element of this, in addition to the breadth of formats and authors, is quality. So the literature considered gray literature, if you're going to include it, should be of sufficient quality to be collected and preserved by libraries and institutional repositories, but not controlled by commercial publishers. Some other terms that are used to describe gray literature are fuzzy literature, fugitive literature, ephemeral. It's harder to track down in many ways. The parameters are fuzzier, and in some ways more flexible than searching peer-reviewed literature. So that can be a good thing. And there's also fuzziness in how people define these parameters. So gray literature to one person depending on their context or their discipline, might look very different to another person or team. And we'll go into more of the specifics in a bit. So next slide, please. To give some concrete examples of gray literature, the government is seen as the most prolific producer of gray literature, although gray literature is published by think tanks, academics, industry, community organizations in myriad formats, so as seen by the previous definition. So some of the more commonly utilized forms that are cited in a systematic review or other evidence synthesis research might be reports, dissertations, working papers, data sets, guidelines, standards. In some disciplines, it might look different. So it might be a newsletter. It really depends on what your research focus is and your question and the evidence that would be most useful to collect for your review. But this slide does go over a few of additional formats that I did not mention. So manuals, brochures, fact sheets, think tank reports, working papers. So as you can see, there's a very diverse array, and this calls for devising an in-depth strategy that goes beyond traditional databases, and that's what we'll address later on in the webinar. Yes, okay. I do see a question that maybe I could actually address now. So I would say yes to those formats, Judith. So a lot of this is context specific. So it's up to your team to define beyond the peer-reviewed process and edited books. So anything that's not published through a commercial or academic publisher that would provide valuable evidence is probably fair game as gray literature. Okay. So we also just wanted to distinguish gray literature from what is not gray. So these are some of the more traditional published formats of literature. So scholarly journals, AKA peer-reviewed or academic journals, newspapers, magazines, whether they be from popular magazines or trade journals. If they're published by an academic or commercial publisher, they are not technically gray literature. That doesn't mean that you could not have a rationale for including them, depending on the goal of your research. But these are not part of what's officially termed gray literature. And then also books or book chapters. Okay, next slide, please. So gray literature is a rich source of data for many systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and scoping reviews, and it can fill many of the gaps that are not addressed through the peer-reviewed literature and incorporate data from a broader range of stakeholders. So gray literature allows your research team, so including the gray literature, allows your research team to take advantage of communities of practice and research that are not fully represented in the peer-reviewed literature. So one key asset or advantage to including the gray literature in a review is that in many cases, the peer-reviewed literature does not provide a complete picture of the available evidence on a topic, and this is across the disciplines. People speak of what's called the file drawer effect in the literature, which means that many researchers choose, for one reason or another, not to publish findings. They might find these findings unremarkable. They may determine that they don't, advance their career or their agenda. So they may just file them away, even though they do add to the effect size of a pertaining to a particular study. So research that is reported in the gray literature can balance this out drawing from a broader pool of evidence, and including those unremarkable or sort of or in some cases findings that are seen as negative, which can skew the evidence on a topic, obviously. So gray literature can also provide additional data in cases where there might be a paucity or a dearth of evidence reported in the peer-reviewed literature. A comprehensive search of the gray literature can balance out publication bias, essentially, by providing more comprehensive evidence. And this slide goes into a little bit more detail, but that's the overall takeaway. Oh, next slide, that's fine. Okay, so there are other biases that a targeted search of the gray literature could compensate for. So involving the gray literature in your search allows you to include voices that may not be present in the peer-reviewed literature, and that might in many ways be crucial to a comprehensive review of the evidence on a topic. So there's an article by Godin et al., and I'll share that citation, or maybe Emily can share that, which describes a systematic review that was developed and applied on the topic of school-based breakfast programs in Canada. So a review of the evidence on this topic required going beyond the peer-reviewed literature to explore the availability of guidelines and best practices for school-based breakfast programs, as well as potential discrepancies in how these guidelines are applied or made available to practitioners. So an in-depth search of, in this case, governmental and non-governmental organizational gray literature produced by practitioners and other communities offered a range of diverse data points that would not be addressed through solely the peer-reviewed literature. So I highly recommend that case study to anyone that wants to see a model of a systematic review involving an in-depth gray literature search strategy and the value of doing that. So just to say a little bit more about this, there are biases in how editorial boards are comprised, who they're comprised of. There are biases in what type of research they will publish. And in many cases, this is seen to sort of maintain existing power structures and exclude newer voices in particular topics. And in some cases, people may not have the resources or the background to publish their research in a peer-reviewed journal, or the support to do so in their job or for their organization that they work for. So in having an in-depth strategy for determining where literature is published beyond the peer-reviewed literature will allow you to represent a broader range of evidence and balance out this type of bias in the research. Next slide. Okay, so timeliness is a key factor that can limit the availability of evidence. So as we all know, the peer-reviewed publication cycle is arduous. So it takes sometimes months to years to publish a study. So having a strategy for capturing research in progress or in process before it reaches the final publication stage can balance out the evidence on a topic and allow you to have a more comprehensive data set related to your research question. And, not only capturing it at an earlier stage, but as I previously mentioned, for one reason or another, researchers may choose not to publish their research at all, but they may in a peer-reviewed format, but they may make it available in a non-peer-reviewed gray format. And that's the whole point, basically, to capture research that will balance out sort of the deficiencies of the peer review format. Next slide. Okay. And I touched on this in the example from the school lunch article, but depending on what your focus is, you'll want to take some time to discuss with your research team who would be most likely to produce the gray literature related to your research area. And these are just some examples of research, gray literature that is produced from practice. So non-governmental agencies or organizations, think tanks, government agencies, policymakers. So all of these people work in the field of research, but may not ultimately publish through the peer review channel. Industry, and also guidelines. Next slide, please. And this is just to summarize the pros and cons that I've hopefully highlighted. Gray literature allows you to combat biases. We don't have a lot of time to go into this, but it might also introduce new biases in of itself. So that is an element of including gray literature, and that is a rationale for having adhering to your inclusion guidelines in evaluating which gray literature to include. Currency, so you can draw from a more current pool of evidence from a broader range of stakeholders, and ultimately have a more comprehensive data set. So this does complicate matters. So this is adding a whole layer of work to your process. And just as gray literature is sort of referred to as fuzzy or gray, the procedures for searching it are not as necessarily set in stone. But Rosie will do a wonderful job of just outlining some ways to get started and to bring order to this somewhat more gray, fuzzy, and flexible process than searching the peer-reviewed literature might be. So, as I mentioned previously, as much as gray literature might reduce bias, it might also introduce some bias as well. And you have to know when enough is enough. So you're going to be searching databases, other search engines, Google Scholar, etc. So you have to have clear a plan for sort of where to cap it off and how to structure this search. And as I mentioned, Rosie will begin providing guidance in this area. But first, she's going to mention some standards related to gray literature in the health sciences.
Thank you, Annie. So just to wrap up this section on the value of searching gray literature or why to do it, in addition to the fact that we think it has value, another important reason to do it is because the guidelines that outline how to conduct systematic and other types of reviews say that we should. So this here is an excerpt from the ME-Course standards, which are the established standards for Cochrane reviews of intervention effectiveness. And for these reviews, which are, traditional clinical effectiveness reviews, it is mandatory to search clinical trial registers and repositories of trial results where it's relevant, and it's highly desirable to search for other relevant gray literature sources for Cochrane reviews. We want to make our search as extensive as possible. And there is an asterisk there just to emphasize that this obviously won't apply to all reviews and all disciplines. But if you're looking for randomized controlled trials, you likely will want to look in a trial registry, which we'll talk about more in just a minute. And then there's a couple of similar excerpts from the Campbell Collaboration Manual. This is similar to the Cochrane Collaboration. They are a research collective that does evidence synthesis in the social sciences. So in their manual, they point out that failing to identify gray literature might bias your results. And the JBI manual for evidence synthesis is healthcare evidence synthesis. Also outlines that reviewers should consider gray literature in addition to traditional publication types. All right, so that's why should we search it. Now we want to know, how do we search it? Before you do a gray literature search, you want to talk this over with your team when you're at the protocol development stage. So what type of review are you doing? Are there guidelines, like in the previous slides, that you can refer to provide you with some instructions on what you need to look for? What type of gray literature are you looking for? Are you looking for clinical trials? Are you looking for policy implementation examples? Are you looking for something else? Typically, if you're writing a review on a topic, you may be familiar enough with the research in your area in this topic to know, okay, I don't think we're looking for clinical trials, but I think there might be independent public health organizations that might be doing studies on this topic or similar. You can look at similar published reviews, especially in a journal that you might be targeting for publication of your review, to see what sources they searched. Unfortunately, gray literature searches aren't always well described in published reviews, but sometimes they do list the sources that were searched. And just keep in mind that you don't have to search everything that's out there. You only need to search the sources that, based on your expertise, it makes sense to include. Because you're doing the gray literature search after you have established your protocol, that's going to include your eligibility criteria, also known as inclusion or exclusion criteria. And those will be the same for any study that you include in your review, regardless of whether it's published in scholarly literature or gray literature. Meaning that if your inclusion criteria are that you want to find only primary research studies that look at a particular intervention with a particular population, your gray literature, if you want to include them, must also meet those same criteria. You're not going to include things like news summaries of a study. You really only want to include a study itself. You don't want to include websites about research. You want to find the primary documents associated with that research. And I have worked on reviews before where the author team decides they don't want to search gray literature at all. They want to say for inclusion criteria that the study must be published in a peer-reviewed journal. And all I want to say to that is that if that is a decision you make, if you feel like searching the gray literature isn't something you have resources to do, or you genuinely don't believe you're going to find anything of interest in the gray literature or anything relevant, just be prepared to back up why that is the decision you're making, because you might peer reviewers might push back on that. Where to search for gray literature? Obviously, it depends. You'll probably hear us say it depends a lot today, but it depends on what type of gray literature you're looking for. Again, if you're doing a traditional systematic review of intervention trial effectiveness, if you're answering a clinical effectiveness question, the classic source is clinical trial registers. And If you're affiliated with UIC, you have access to the Cochrane database, the Cochrane Library database. This little pathway tells you how to get there from our library website. It's listed under our main databases list. The Cochrane Library contains several different databases, and including Central, which is the Controlled Trial Register. Central includes clinicaltrials.gov, the US Clinical Trial Register. It includes ICTRP, which is the WHO's International Clinical Trials Registry platform, and it includes other trial registers. So if you're searching Central, you're searching all of those sources. If you're not affiliated with an institution that has access to the Cochrane Library, you can search clinicaltrials.gov on its own and ICTRP on its own. If you're looking for conference abstracts, conference proceedings, or papers, you can often find these in traditional databases. So they're included in PubMed, but Embase, which is a similar database to PubMed, it's a large health sciences and life sciences focused database. Embase will index individual conference abstracts. By that I mean in PubMed, you'll see conference proceedings in there sometimes, but you'll have one search result with like 1,000 authors on it, and it'll be all of the abstracts from an entire conference mushed together in one record, in one article. So it can be difficult for PubMed to retrieve conference abstracts that match your title and abstract search terms. If you're searching Embase as well, in addition to PubMed for a health sciences review, it will bring back more conference abstracts because they're listed individually in the database. We also have a database called Proceedings First, which you can search for conference proceedings. I did a couple cursory searches of that last week. It seems to be especially strong in computer science and engineering conferences. So those are two library databases that are good to search for conference proceedings. And then you can also just identify annual meetings or annual conferences of researchers that study this topic and go to the websites of those annual meetings and just do hand search, look through the proceedings for the past X number of years, 5 or 10, or however many you think is reasonable. Dissertations and theses are a great source of recent research. You know, they may eventually be turned into scholarly articles or books, but if you want to capture them when they're at the dissertation stage, there are library databases. ProQuest Dissertations and Theses just searches, as the name implies, dissertations and theses. And then the other 3 databases listed here, ERIC for education, CINAHL, nursing and allied health, and PsycInfo for psychology and related disciplines. Those include dissertations and theses in addition to scholarly articles and other resources that are in those databases. You can also search Google Scholar for dissertations. In addition to retrieving scholarly articles, Google Scholar crawls institutional repositories. So at UIC, for example, we have Indigo, our institutional repository, where students can, among other things, students can post their dissertations and theses. And so you'll find some of those if you're searching Google Scholar as well. If you think that you might find research in reports, working papers, sort of what we call, generally speaking, the reports literature, again, that might be in a library database that you're already searching for scholarly literature. EconLit has a lot of working papers from the National Bureau of Economics Research. Public Affairs Information Service Index, which is public affairs, public policy, will have gray literature research reports as well. A somewhat recent addition to the library's collections is a database called Policy Commons. And right now we have access to the Global Think Tanks module within that database. So if you're researching something related to global health, international development, etc., it might be of value to search Policy Commons. Policy Commons is exclusively a gray literature database. And then ERIC as well has research reports in it. One website that I love and I recommend to students and researchers all the time is a think tank search that comes out of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And it's essentially a custom Google search function that searches the websites of over 1,000 think tanks, independent research organizations, foundations across the political spectrum. I've got a screenshot on the next page, but it really helps you cut straight to the type of substantive information that we're talking about when we refer to gray literature. And then you can also, if you know organizations that are doing research on a topic, you can just go to their website and do a search. Of course, that depends on knowing who those organizations are. So the link to the think tank search is in the chat, and we'll send that out with the recording as well. This is just an example of what it might look like if I go to that page and I do a search for migrant healthcare. It looks just like a regular Google search, but you'll see based on the web addresses, we've got results coming from Urban Institute, KFF, and other similar think tanks and research groups. All right, so in addition to those specialized resources, you might also do just general web searches. As I just mentioned, you might know the websites of certain organizations and target those websites. You can do general Google searches. You can search individual websites via Google, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And if you're looking for a particular file format, let's say you're doing a mapping review of a particular type of pedagogical approach, and you want to look for PowerPoint files, you can look for a specific file type using Google. So how do we do that? First, last week, if you attended our database translation webinar last week, we talked about how from one database to another, your searches should be as similar as possible. So you're not going to be doing a lot of changing up of the number of terms that you're using, the search concepts you're using, the ands and ors, those Boolean operators. They're really going to look the same from one traditional database to the next. With gray literature sources, it depends, but it's often not possible to just copy and paste a search like you would from one database to another. So depending on the resource you're searching, you want to figure out, is there a limit to the number of words you can type in, to the number of search characters? Does the resource support Boolean operators? And as much as possible, you want to try to keep your search concepts the same. That would be the population, intervention, the outcome of interest, approach of interest, etc., even if you can't use the entire same search string. So one of the most common barriers we'll run into is that there's a limit and the searches have to be much shorter, many fewer characters when compared to a library database. So you want to prioritize the most common terms from your search. So what's the most likely to retrieve results? If you're using Google, which is still my search engine of choice, there are others, but a couple tips if you want to use Google to search to do your gray literature searches. You can search in incognito mode to turn off the personalizations and the location filters and other things that Google will apply to personalize your results for you, which makes your search a bit more reproducible. We never know exactly what's going on behind the curtain with Google, but that can help. On your search results screen in Google, you'll see a link for tools, and there's something called the verbatim search, which means search my terms exactly as I type them in. Don't look for synonyms or related terms. And then obviously, we're not going to be able to look at all of the results from a Google search. So you're going to indicate how many of those you screened. A common number to screen is the first 100 results. In Google, you're going to use double quotation marks to search bound phrases and to search for exactly a certain word. You can use cite, S-I-T-E with a colon, before a particular term or a web domain name to see only pages where the URL includes that word. So you could say, we did a gray literature search of government websites by searching housing policy site gov or .gov. And then I'm going to show you an example in just a couple of minutes from a review that I worked on, but you can search multiple individual websites using Google. So you could say, we searched the website of KFF for seasonal farm workers in healthcare. And in terms of Boolean operators, if you don't put any terms in between your search terms, Google will assume and, meaning it will include all of the terms that you type in. Google does seem to support or. So if you put or in between two terms, it will search for one or the other or both. But I could not find anything on I could not find any official Google guide or documentation that confirmed this. So I didn't put it in the slide, but it does seem to work. When you're doing Google searches for your gray literature, you have a couple of options for how to save the stuff that you come across. Really, the simplest way to do this would be to do the search, and then while you have it open, just go through manually and screen results, keep track of how many you're screening, and then as you encounter resources that you might want to include, you can save them one by one with a citation manager like Zotero. If you're going to use that approach, you want to open each result in a separate window, because if you click away from your results page and click back, your search might refresh and Google will update the results, sometimes even based on what you clicked. So it'll use that information to inform what it thinks you're interested in. So if you want to just do one search and screen all of those results, you want to keep that results page open and then look at the results in a separate tab, if that makes sense. You can also, especially if you want help from more than one team member in screening your search results from Google, you can save them to a spreadsheet using plugins for your browser. So there's a Google Chrome extension called Link Clipper that seems to work okay. I tested it out last week, and so this is what it looks like. If you click the Link Clipper button in your browser, you can either select individual links at a time, or you can extract all of the links on your Google results page, which is what I did. And it exports it as a CSV file, which you can open in Excel or in Google Sheets. And you'll see here, it really does extract every single link that it finds on the page. So that includes all of the websites that Google is listing as results. It's also including the extra links that Google puts in. So it might have a link to your Gmail account. It might have a link to an ad. It'll have those little suggestions it puts in for, if you're searching for this, you might also be interested in this. All of those links are going to come out in this spreadsheet. So what you would do then is go through and clean this up and remove all of those superfluous links. So you can see, for example, in this screenshot, depending on how big your screen is, down at the bottom are some of those sort of junk Google URLs that are pretty easy to identify, right? It's a long Google address with my search terms at the end there. But then closer to the top of this screenshot, you'll see there are actually some, more likely to be relevant, government documents and other organizations. I have just a few examples of the type of resources I found with just searching. This was just a search for migrants and healthcare again. So this is something from the state of Massachusetts, something from KFF again, and the Rural Health Information Hub. So depending on the scope and parameters of my review, this might be a fruitful way to find additional resources. I did want to mention a scoping review that I worked on a few years ago with my colleague Amelia Brunskill, who's along with me, she's the co-chair of our systematic reviews committee here at the library, working group, I should say. We did a scoping review of students who are non-users of their academic libraries. In addition to searching, this is from the methods section of our paper. The first paragraph describes the traditional database searches that we did. We included dissertations and theses global in that database list. And then in the second paragraph, we describe additional gray literature sources that we searched. We decided that it was most likely that we were going to find the type of research we were looking for on the websites of specific library professional associations. So we came up with a short list of those. And at first, we were going to go directly to their websites and search them. We noticed that one of the organizations said that the website search didn't include PDFs that might be posted on their web domain. So in any case, what we decided to do in the end was use Google to search each of their sites individually. So what's relevant is really column D here in this screenshot. We used the same Boolean string to describe non-users. We were looking for studies of students who don't use their library. And then for the first search is a bit different. We included the terms academic, college, and university to search a general library organization's website. That's the American Library Association. And then for the other websites, those are all organizations that are specific to the type of library we were looking at. So we didn't include those additional terms. I hope that's clear. But essentially, we used this SITE colon to search individual websites. We used the same, with one exception, the same search terms for each of these. And then we saved the first 100 results using something like Link Clipper. I think it was something different that is no longer in operation. But because we were searching individual websites, except for this first search here, we had fewer than 100 results from each resource. So it wasn't too much to go through. We listed each of the results in a database and went through and did sort of an initial screening of each of these documents. And several of them were relevant to our topic, but did not describe a research study, which was one of our eligibility criteria. So we excluded those and anything else that looked like it might be potentially relevant, we added to our citation manager, Zotero. So in the end, we screened, however many this was, 300, 200 or so gray literature publications. We included fewer than 10 of them in our final review. In this review, we had almost 70 studies included. 25 of these studies were gray literature publications, and the remainder came from scholarly journals. So we had gray literature coming from these Google searches, as well as from some of the library databases that we searched. So it did result in a handful of studies that we would not have otherwise found being added to our search. One question that comes up quite often when dealing with gray literature, especially trial registries. What do I do if all I have is an abstract? First and foremost, having if your search results in like a conference abstract or a study protocol, that in and of itself is not a reason to exclude the study from your review. What you want to do is first you can do a search by the funding number of the grant or by author names. You can do a general Google search to see if you can find any associated data or publications. You can contact the authors directly. You won't always get a response, but sometimes, you'll be surprised at how many folks are willing and eager to share their study results that might just not have been published yet. So if you contact authors and you don't get a response, you can always indicate in an appendix or within the paper itself that there were studies that appeared to fit your eligibility criteria, but you weren't able to get any data or full text of those, and you can list the citations. Or if you have enough to mention that a study is ongoing on this topic, you can include it in the qualitative synthesis of your review. So meaning in the body of your results, you can cite it and describe the information that you were able to find, but then exclude it from the quantitative synthesis, which is the meta-analysis if you're doing one. So you wouldn't have a data set that you could add into your analysis, but you would be able to at least mention it and cite it. And then finally, when you're documenting your search, this is an area where we have a lot of room for improvement in terms of guidance on how to do this. But remember those overall goals of a review of transparency and reproducibility. So describe what you did, what websites you searched. You don't necessarily have to justify why you chose those and not others, just list them. Focus on accurately describing what you did. So again, it's a gray area. This can really explode and spiral, especially if you're looking at more of a something like research reports as opposed to clinical trial registers, which have more defined parameters. But just whatever your decision is, be transparent about what you did search, and then ask yourself if your reader could follow the same steps from your manuscript. It's not guaranteed, especially if you're doing something like a web search engine search. It's not a guarantee that they would get the same results, but can they search the same sources with the same keywords and screen the same number of results? So that's what you want to report out. Annie has added a few readings to a group library in Zotero, which the link is going to be put in the chat in just a moment. I'd recommend that you check those out. And while you're there, the library, you'll see over on the left a navigation menu. This is our collective public library of review methodology readings. So you can click around to the other folders while you're there and check out what we have to offer. And in just a moment, we'll stop the recording and take your questions, but we wanted to give you our contact information. If you have any follow-up questions, if you want to make an appointment with a librarian to talk about any of this in more detail, you can email us, or you can always use the contact us link on our library website. We're going to send out a recording of this video. I'm going to say within 1 week, hopefully sooner, but I'll give myself a little leeway. And we'll send out all of the resources that we link to in the slides. We hope you can join us next week, especially those of you who are faculty members. Annie and our colleague Abigail Gobin are going to be talking about considerations for assigning evidence synthesis or systematic reviews in the classroom. And then finally, We really do appreciate if you're able to fill out our evaluation, which is going in the chat now. This helps us, this is the first semester that we're doing this webinar series, so any information you can provide to help us improve for next time is much appreciated.